Hi everyone, welcome to Workshop 2. We're looking at chapters 15 and 16 this week. Chapter 15 is job order costing. Chapter 16 is process costing. These are the two main manufacturing cost systems that we'll use in practice. They work quite a bit different and they're used for quite a bit different reasons. The first one we'll look at for chapter 15 is job order costing. And the reason that you use job order costing is whenever you have unique products that you're producing that are high dollar items, and you'll need to know the specific costs associated with each one of these, what we call jobs, or each one of these products that you're producing. So an example would be a custom home builder. This person is going and spending, a couple $100,000 or millions of dollars on building homes. You want to know directly associated with this particular job how much raw materials, direct labor, and overhead are associated with the particular job at hand. And you would track this for each one of the different jobs that you have. So you would not do this if you're producing mass bulk items like pencils or paper clips, something like that. We'll use that for process costing in chapter 16. So job order costing are more unique, larger products that we're producing where we need to know specifically the information and costs associated with that particular product. Now, the information is more readily available and more accurate, but the cost to track these are also more than under process costing. So those you have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each as you progress through it. So how does this actually work? Well, we're going to basically break each product that we're producing into what we call a job or a job cost sheet. That is an example shown on page 639 of a job cost sheet. And what we're doing is we're tracking all of the raw materials, direct labor, and overhead that's associated with each job directly to it. So I've drawn a couple things out on the dry erase here. So we have our raw materials, our direct labor, and our overhead. And what we'll do is we'll basically say, well, how much raw materials goes into job one? How much into direct labor, and how much of overhead? We'll track these all in figuring out how much goes into the job. Now, as we begin working on this job, for example, the custom home, as it's in production, it'll be in the work in process account. When it gets finished, remember, like we talked about last workshop, it goes to finished goods. When it's sold, it comes out of finished goods and goes to cost of goods sold. Same thing for job two. We would actually track whenever we issue raw materials out of our supply cabinet or wherever we're having our materials. Well, when we issue those to the jobs, they'll be transferred from the raw materials to the actual job under work in process. Same thing with direct labor. Those will be charged to job two, and same thing with overhead. So we're tracking all of these individually by job so that as we work, say we're 2 months along in building this home, we can look at our records and say, well, we spent $150,000 of cost, maybe $100,000 in raw materials, maybe $30,000 in direct labor, and $20,000 overhead. And we can track on an ongoing basis how much the actual job is costing us. Same thing for, job two, however many jobs that you're doing. Now, you would have to have a slew of accountants to do this if you had small generic products. So we're only using this for major products like custom homes, custom cars, things like that, where we need to know on an ongoing perpetual basis how much it actually costs us. Now let's look real quick about this overhead. Now it's pretty simple. As we use raw materials, we know the cost of raw materials and direct labor. As we pay people to work on the jobs, we know how much those cost. And think back to last workshop whenever we talked about direct costs. These are direct. This is indirect. We don't necessarily know how much of, say, the foreman salary, the supervisor salary is associated with job one and job two. They're not directly working on these jobs. So what we have to do is we have to allocate our overhead. This is something that we've outlined on the bottom of page 1 for the chapter 2 study guide. So how do we actually figure out how much overhead that we are going to assign each job? Well, that's what overhead allocation is for. So in the example that I've shown you, the calculation is on page 644. But the example I've given you, I say we have $1 million in estimated overhead costs. These are, we're going to have to make some estimates at the beginning of the period. $1 million in estimated overhead costs, and we're going to figure out what is the best way to assign these overhead costs to the specific job. So how does it tend to behave? As something goes up, overhead costs likely go up as well. We have to figure out what our cost driver is. That's what we call that. And in the case I've given you here, direct labor is what we're using as our cost driver. So we're figuring out how much overhead needs to be assigned for every direct labor hour that's incurred on each job. So in the example here, I've given you $1 million of estimated overhead. This is something we would come up with at the beginning of the period, and we're saying that there's an estimated $50,000 direct labor hours. So this is our estimated overhead. This is our direct labor hours estimate. And so we figure out that is $20 per direct labor hour. What does this mean? Well, as we go, remember we had raw materials, direct labor, overhead, and we assign these to the specific jobs. For every hour of direct labor that we're assigning to our job cost sheet, we're going to assign $20 of overhead as well. So we might have 10 direct labor hours billed to this particular job. Whatever the cost of the direct labor is, that's going to be under the direct labor line, but we also need to allocate our overhead based on that direct labor. So the 10 hours times the rate of $20 per hour, we would assign overhead to that job of $200, okay? So we do this as an ongoing basis. Now remember, this is an estimate, but we do this so that, we might start this at January 1. We're not going to know the actual amount of this or of this till the end of the period. But for purposes of timely information, we need to know on an ongoing basis, what if we get to the end of February? What is the amount of overhead that we're estimating is going to be allocated to these particular jobs so that we can price those out properly? Now, when we do get to 12/31, our overhead is probably not going to be $1 million. Our overhead might be $940,000. And if we look at all our jobs that we worked on during the year, remember we allocated our overhead to these particular jobs based on our direct labor hours. We might have a total allocated overhead of $900,000. So likely we didn't quite get up to our 50,000 direct labor hours. We only had 45,000 hours. So 45,000 times 20 is 900,000. So what's the difference here? Well, there's a $40,000 difference of what our actual overhead cost was and what our estimate, what our actual overhead cost was and what our allocated overhead costs based on our estimates were. So we have that $40,000 difference. This is a amount that I've shown you on the bottom of page 1 what we actually do. On 647, 648, those are the examples of how you actually do this. So what you do is you have this extra $40,000 of expense. Rather than taking it to the actual job under work in process or finished goods, we pretty much just take that to cost of goods sold. So there will be an extra entry that you'll see so that we're accounting for all of the costs. We knew the raw materials and direct labor, those were the direct costs. We've accounted for all of those as we've gone through our job cost sheets. Our overhead, we had to use an estimate. So we had previously accounted for 900,000 of it. We have 40,000 that's left. So we need to make sure that we pick this up somewhere. And what we typically do is we just take that to cost of goods sold. So this 40,000 is not going to be allocated to the specific jobs on the job cost sheets because they're only allocated for this 900,000. This is just going to be taken to cost of goods sold. If you have any questions about that, we'll discuss that in the discussion board. That's pretty much job order costing. Make sure that you understand that each job has its own raw materials, direct labor, and overhead associated with it. So we're tracking it on an ongoing basis. There's more detail. It's more costly to track. But we can use this information. What if we get to the conclusion of building a custom home and we say, well, it cost us $300,000 to build the home. Well, and if we want a, let's say, 100% profit margin, we would price that at $600,000. We would double our cost and price it at that particular amount. If we wanted a 10% profit margin, we might price it at $330,000. So we would base that based on what our job cost sheet tells us through job order costing. So that's essentially chapter 15. We'll go on to chapter 16 for process costing now.